Hi everyone. In an earlier video I did this week, we spoke about the roles of the regulator. In my history with workplace health and safety, I've always found a bit of an interesting mixed bag of responses from people when you talk about WorkSafe or the equivalent regulator in your jurisdiction. I've always been particularly fascinated from an employee perspective who seem to have this negative perception of the role of an inspector, when in fact the inspector's really there for them and to help them. I just want to talk a little bit more about the regulators, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about here is actually based on Victoria here in Australia. Obviously that's where I'm located, and there may be some variations depending on the jurisdiction you're in, but first and foremost, the role of the regulator or the role of the inspector. First and foremost, they're there to provide advice. They're there to offer assistance and guidance. They have a role, obviously, to inspect the workplace, have a look for workplace health and safety issues, whether it be breaches and unsafe conditions and hazards and risks and so forth. And they're there to enforce the law. So there's obviously very clear legislation around what they can and can't do and sort of things that they're looking for. So it might be related to confined spaces, work at heights, dangerous goods, asbestos, things like that. They've also got an education part that's a key part of their role, and that's just about advising people of their rights and responsibilities under the legislation. It's also about providing guidance and assistance, and then it's also about promoting consultation and discussions and so forth between employees and employers. One of the big things, particularly if we're going to talk investigations, is notifiable incidents. And again, as I said, this is going to be based on Victoria, it's again where I'm located. So under legislation, you have to notify the regulator of incidents. So the type of incidents you need to notify them of include obviously deaths in the workplace, serious injury, and there's quite a comprehensive list of serious injuries or what constitutes a serious injury, and that can be things like medical treatment within 48 hours of exposure to a substance. It could also be inpatient treatment at a hospital. It could also be medical treatment for serious injuries, so that could be things like an amputation, serious head injury, eye injuries, electric shock, spinal injuries, and a raft of others that sit there. The big one, and I think this is where a lot of people come unstuck or don't understand the roles and the rights of inspectors, is actually their powers. You're talking about a person or an organisation or a role that has very, very substantial powers in the workplace. So they've actually got a right of entry into any workplace 24/7, day or night. If you're in operation, they have a right to enter that workplace under legislation. They also have the right to issue PIN notices or provisional improvement notices. So that might be where they find something that is serious, that needs to be addressed. It may not necessarily be life-threatening, for example, but they see there's an issue. There may be a problem with signage, for example, on a machine or something. Does it mean that the machine can't be used? No, it can't, but it does pose a hazard. They can also issue prohibition notices, so they prohibit you from obviously using plant and equipment and so forth. They can conduct interviews with employees. They can take photos, they can take recordings, measurements, they can take possession of items, so equipment for example, and they can take that for testing, they could use it as evidence and things like that. They can take samples, so it might be samples of products and hazardous substances. They can view and examine documents and so on. And obviously what they're looking for is any breaches to the legislation. A lot of people ask us as investigators ourselves, what's the difference between a safety-wise investigator and a WorkSafe investigator, for example, or an inspector? Obviously with an inspectorate, they're operating under legislation and they're looking for breaches of legislation. They're very similar to us in that they're looking to see what happened, how something happened, what needs to be done to prevent it, but they're also looking very specifically at legislation. If I look at WorkSafe, we do all of that as well, but we have no legislative power, so we're generally appointed by a company or an organisation or their legal counsel on behalf of that company. So again, we don't have those rights. We don't have a right of entry. We don't have a right to take documents. We don't have a right to issue notices, things like that. So we're purely looking at an investigation from the perspective of identifying what happened, how it happened, and most importantly, how do we prevent it from recurring? And we may or may not look at legislation. That may not be a specific part of what we're looking at. We could be looking at training issues, documentation issues, workplace culture, organisational culture, I should say, and things like that. So I hope that helps. I really hope that people understand the role of an inspectorate and what they do, and the fact that they are there to help you, not there to hinder you, cause you problems and so forth. Thanks for your time. Hope you enjoyed.